I stepped outside, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction as I admired the freshly installed solar panels on my roof. The sun gleamed off their sleek surface, a reflection of both environmental consciousness and long-term savings. It had taken weeks of planning, research, and dealing with contractors, but finally, my house was equipped with renewable energy. I was proud, not just for myself but for what this meant, a step toward sustainability, lower bills, and a bit of independence from the power company. It was perfect. Or at least, I thought so. I barely had time to enjoy the moment before I noticed a familiar figure marching up my driveway, her arms crossed so tightly that her veins bulged against her pale skin. Karen. The self-appointed dictator of our HOA. She was the kind of woman who took her role way too seriously, acting as if the entire neighborhood was her personal kingdom. It wasn't enough that she sent out weekly emails demanding lawn perfection and precise trash can placement, she always found something new to micromanage. And today, it was my solar panels. I braced myself as she stomped forward, her mouth already twisted in that signature scowl. Her heels clicked against the pavement with unnecessary force, as if she thought intimidation started from the ground up. "Jake," she barked, not bothering with pleasantries. "What in the world is this monstrosity on your roof?" I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. I had been expecting this reaction, but I had hoped for at least a few days of peace before the inevitable showdown. "They're solar panels, Karen," I said evenly. "I got them installed last week." She let out a dramatic gasp, her hand flying to her chest as if I had just told her I had adopted a pack of wild wolves and let them roam freely. "This is completely unacceptable. Do you realize what you've done? You're ruining the entire aesthetic of the neighborhood." I glanced around, noting the rows of nearly identical houses, all sporting beige walls and neatly trimmed lawns. My solar panels were barely noticeable unless someone was specifically looking for them. But of course, Karen had looked. And she had found her next victim. "They're legal," I pointed out. "I checked state regulations before installing them. There's nothing in the HOA bylaws that forbids solar panels." Karen's eyes narrowed, her expression darkening. "That's not the point," she hissed. "The point is that they look hideous. We have an image to maintain, Jake. This neighborhood is a respectable, uniform community. We can't have houses looking like some sort of futuristic science experiment. What will people think?" I resisted the urge to laugh. "Karen, people aren't going to care. If anything, they might want to install some themselves. They save money and help the environment." Her face twisted in horror, as if I had suggested we all start raising chickens in our backyards and hanging laundry on lines like it was the 1800s. "Absolutely not. I will not allow this. You need to have them removed immediately." I crossed my arms, standing my ground. "Not going to happen." She let out a sharp breath, her nostrils flaring. "Oh, you think you're clever, don't you? Well, you forget that I have authority here. I can file a formal complaint. I can take this to the HOA board." "Go ahead," I said, shrugging. "I already checked. The HOA can't override state laws protecting homeowners' rights to install solar panels." Karen's jaw clenched, and for a brief second, I thought she might actually explode on the spot. She clearly wasn't used to being challenged, especially when she thought she had the upper hand. But instead of backing down, she smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a flicker of unease through me. "Oh, Jake," she purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." And with that, she turned on her heel and stormed off, her posture rigid, her steps heavy. I watched her retreat, a feeling of unease settling in my gut. Karen didn't take no for an answer. She was the kind of person who made it her mission to win, no matter how petty the battle. And something told me that this was far from over. I tried to brush it off, but that lingering sense of foreboding stayed with me. It wasn't until 2 days later, when I found a brightly colored legal notice taped to my front door, that I realized just how far she was willing to go. Karen was suing me. The bright yellow notice stuck to my door was impossible to miss. The bold, aggressive lettering at the top declared notice of legal action, and as my eyes scanned the text below, my stomach tightened. Karen had actually gone through with it. She had filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that my solar panels violated the visual harmony of the neighborhood and constituted a nuisance to the community. The language was dramatic, filled with overblown statements about how my panels were an eyesore that brought down property values and disrupted the carefully cultivated aesthetic of the HOA. It was absurd, but it was also completely on brand for Karen. If she couldn't win through intimidation, she would try to bury me in bureaucracy. I took a deep breath and read the notice again, trying to keep my anger in check. It listed a court date for a preliminary hearing and demanded that I remove the panels immediately to avoid further legal consequences. I knew better than to fall for her scare tactics, but I also knew this wasn't something I could ignore. Karen had been waiting for an opportunity to flex her power, and now she had found it. This wasn't just about my solar panels anymore, it was about control. She needed to prove that she could still dictate what happened in this neighborhood, even if it meant twisting the rules to suit her agenda. The next few days were a whirlwind of research, phone calls, and gathering documents. I needed to be prepared, because if Karen thought she could steamroll me into submission, she was in for a rude awakening. I found an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, a sharp and seasoned woman named Lisa who had dealt with plenty of overzealous HOA presidents before. After reviewing my case, she reassured me that I was well within my legal rights and that Karen's claims were weak at best. Still, we couldn't take anything for granted. Karen was manipulative, and if she had any tricks up her sleeve, we needed to be ready. Word about the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. I had expected some people to side with Karen, but to my surprise, many of my neighbors were quietly supportive. Some even stopped by to voice their frustration over the HOA's constant interference in their lives. It turned out that I wasn't the only one fed up with Karen's power trips. She had been making arbitrary rules for years, issuing fines for minor infractions, and rejecting reasonable requests just because she could. My solar panels had simply given her the excuse she needed to try and assert her dominance again. As the court date approached, I noticed Karen doubling down on her efforts to control the narrative. She sent out a lengthy email to the entire HOA mailing list, framing herself as a protector of the neighborhood's values. She claimed that my defiance was setting a dangerous precedent, and that if I was allowed to keep my panels, it would lead to chaos, people painting their houses in garish colors, installing tacky decorations, or, in her words, turning this community into a mismatched nightmare. The fear-mongering was blatant, and while some people might have bought into her rhetoric, I could tell that many were starting to see through it. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer by my side, ready for whatever Karen had planned. She was already there, perched in a stiff-backed chair with a smug expression, as if she had already won. Dressed in her usual prim blazer and pearls, she sat with perfect posture, clutching a folder filled with documents that she probably thought would be enough to bring me down. The arrogance was almost impressive. The hearing was straightforward. My lawyer presented the state laws protecting homeowners' rights to install solar panels, emphasizing that HOA regulations could not override state law. She pointed out that my panels were not in violation of any written HOA rules and that Karen was trying to enforce an arbitrary standard based on her personal preferences rather than legal guidelines. Karen, of course, argued that the panels disrupted the uniform beauty of the neighborhood, but when pressed, she couldn't provide any real evidence that my panels had any negative impact whatsoever. In fact, my attorney even brought up data showing that solar panels increased property values, directly contradicting Karen's claims. Karen grew increasingly flustered as the judge asked pointed questions, her confident demeanor cracking as she realized that her arguments weren't holding up. She tried to spin it as a matter of community well-being, but it was clear to everyone in the room that this was nothing more than a power play. When the judge finally delivered the ruling, it was as satisfying as I had hoped. The lawsuit was dismissed. Karen had no legal standing to force me to remove my solar panels, and the judge even cautioned her against using HOA resources for personal vendettas. She had lost badly. But if I had thought that was the end of it, I was sorely mistaken. Karen might have been defeated in court, but she wasn't about to give up. If she couldn't win through legal means, she would find another way. And that's when the real trouble began. Karen's loss in court should have been the end of it, but if there was one thing I had learned about her, it was that she never accepted defeat gracefully. Instead of backing off, she doubled down, shifting her tactics from legal warfare to something far more underhanded. The day after the ruling, I woke up to find a fresh notice from the HOA taped to my front door. This time, it wasn't a lawsuit, but a formal complaint alleging that my solar panels were installed improperly and posed a safety hazard to the neighborhood. It was a transparent attempt to create new problems where none existed, and I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen had wasted no time assembling a small faction of like-minded busybodies within the HOA, people who thrived on rules and control, and who were more than happy to support her crusade under the guise of protecting the neighborhood. Together, they started sending out letters, circulating petitions, and trying to stir up opposition against me. The complaints became more frequent and more absurd, claims that my panels reflected sunlight in a way that blinded passing drivers, that they disrupted local bird migration patterns, that they were emitting dangerous radiation, despite the fact that solar panels don't work that way. It was obvious that Karen wasn't just trying to get rid of my panels anymore, she was trying to make my life miserable. Then came the inspections. Within a week, I had received not one, but two separate visits from city inspectors, both prompted by anonymous complaints about supposed code violations on my property. The first inspector, a tired-looking man who had clearly dealt with this kind of nonsense before, barely glanced at my panels before giving me the all-clear. The second one, however, took his time, measuring, photographing, and asking technical questions about the installation process. It didn't take much to figure out that Karen had done her research and was trying to exploit any possible loophole she could find. But when both inspections ultimately confirmed that my panels were fully compliant with regulations, her frustration must have reached a boiling point. It wasn't long before she escalated to outright harassment. Mysteriously, my trash bins started getting accidentally knocked over on collection day. My mailbox was suddenly stuffed with anonymous HOA violation warnings for things as ridiculous as having an unapproved garden bed, which was just a row of potted plants on my porch. Then, one morning, I stepped outside to find someone had spray-painted a giant eyesore across my driveway. The attempt at intimidation was so pathetic that I almost laughed. It was clear Karen and her minions were getting desperate. Despite everything, I refused to back down. If anything, the more she pushed, the more determined I became to hold my ground. I reached out to my lawyer again, this time not just to defend myself but to go on the offensive. I wanted a record of every baseless complaint, every act of harassment, every ridiculous violation notice. If Karen wanted a war, she was going to get one. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself had started shifting. People who had once been indifferent were now openly turning against Karen. Some were fed up with her authoritarian rule, while others simply saw through her antics. A few even started installing their own solar panels out of sheer defiance, which must have driven her insane. The more she pushed, the more she lost control, and I could see the cracks forming in the grip she had held over this community for years. But the real breaking point came when she made her biggest mistake yet. Late one night, I was woken up by the sound of scraping metal and hushed voices outside my house. My security cameras caught everything: two men, hired by Karen, trying to tamper with my solar panels. They were attempting to damage them, likely hoping to give Karen an excuse to claim they were a hazard and have them forcibly removed. But what they hadn't counted on was the fact that I had upgraded my security system after her last stunt. The moment they touched the panels, an alarm blared through the neighborhood, lights flashing like a beacon in the dark. Neighbors poured out of their houses, drawn by the noise, some holding up their phones to record the scene. The would-be saboteurs panicked, scrambling to escape, but they weren't fast enough. The police arrived within minutes, and under pressure, the men admitted that Karen had paid them to vandalize my property. The moment her name was mentioned, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. Everyone knew Karen was controlling, everyone knew she was manipulative, but this was something else. This was criminal. By morning, the news had spread like wildfire. Karen, the once untouchable queen of the HOA, was now facing potential legal charges for property damage and trespassing. The neighborhood chat groups were flooded with discussions about her abuse of power, and by the afternoon, there was an emergency HOA meeting scheduled. It was clear, her time was finally running out. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community center, a space that had hosted countless tedious gatherings over the years, mostly ones where Karen dictated arbitrary rules and people either grudgingly complied or remained silent to avoid her wrath. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The air buzzed with an energy that hadn't been there before. People weren't just attending because they had to, they were here because they wanted to see what would happen. The whispers and hushed conversations before the meeting began all circled around the same topic: Karen had finally gone too far, and this might be the end of her reign. I arrived early, but the room was already packed. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, some even peering in from the doorway. At the front of the room, Karen sat at the long HOA table, her expression pinched and tight, her usual air of superiority cracking under the weight of the accusations against her. The two men she had hired to vandalize my solar panels had confessed to everything, and the police report had been shared among the residents. Everyone knew what she had done. Even the few people who had once blindly supported her were now shifting uncomfortably, unwilling to publicly align themselves with someone who had just been caught committing a crime. Barbara, the HOA vice president, stood at the podium, her voice cutting through the murmurs. She wasn't particularly fond of me, but she disliked Karen's abuse of power even more. She cleared her throat and wasted no time getting to the point. The charges against Karen were read aloud, each one landing like a heavy blow. Misuse of HOA funds to pursue personal lawsuits. Harassment and intimidation of a community member. Vandalism and property damage through hired saboteurs. The room was silent except for the occasional whisper as people exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to grim satisfaction. Karen sat rigid in her chair, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, her jaw locked as if she could hold back the entire collapse of her power through sheer will. Then the discussion opened to the residents. At first, there was hesitation. People had spent years fearing Karen's wrath, worried about what she might do if they spoke against her. But now, with her influence crumbling, that fear was dissolving. One by one, they stood up, sharing their grievances. A man in the front row recounted how Karen had fined him for leaving his trash bin out an extra hour after pickup. A woman detailed how Karen had once rejected a request to plant flowers in her front yard because the color clashed with the neighborhood's theme. Another neighbor recalled how Karen had forced someone to repaint their front door 3 times in 1 year just because she didn't like the shade of blue they had chosen. It was like a dam had broken, and years of pent-up frustration flooded the room. And then, of course, it was my turn. I stepped forward, feeling the weight of every exhausting battle I had fought with Karen pressing against my shoulders. I didn't need to be dramatic. The facts spoke for themselves. I recounted how she had sued me over something completely legal, how she had weaponized HOA rules to try to make my life miserable, and, finally, how she had committed an actual crime in her desperation to get rid of my solar panels. I didn't even need to embellish the story. everyone had seen the proof, and the weight of her actions was undeniable. When I finished, there was no counter-argument, no clever retort from Karen. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. She opened her mouth once, then closed it. There was nothing left for her to say. The vote to remove her as HOA president was called. The result was swift and brutal. Almost every hand in the room shot up. The few who hesitated quickly caved under the pressure of the majority. The vote wasn't just in favor of removing Karen, it was unanimous. She was done. For the first time since I had moved into this neighborhood, Karen looked small. Defeated. She sat motionless for a long moment before, without a word, she stood up and walked toward the exit. No dramatic speech, no desperate last stand. Just the quiet realization that she had lost everything. The door shut behind her, and the room erupted into cheers. Laughter, claps on the back, relieved sighs. It was as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. People who had been living under Karen's rule for years were now free, and they celebrated accordingly. I stayed for a while, watching as neighbors who had once been at odds started talking to each other again. Some even joked about hosting a block party, something that had been banned under Karen's leadership for being too disruptive. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood actually felt like a community again. By the time I walked home, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over my solar panels. They stood untouched, gleaming in the fading light, a symbol of everything Karen had tried to destroy and failed. As I stepped onto my porch, I noticed a small note tucked under my welcome mat. Expecting another leftover HOA warning, I picked it up warily, but when I read it, I couldn't help but grin. It was from an anonymous neighbor. 4 simple words. Thanks for standing up. In the days following Karen's removal, the neighborhood began to change in ways I hadn't expected. Without her constant interference, people seemed more relaxed, more open. Small things that had once been considered violations, like kids leaving their bikes on the lawn for a few extra hours or someone painting their shutters a different shade, were now just part of life, not reasons for fines or complaints. It was strange to think about how much power one person had wielded over this community for so long, dictating every little detail and forcing people to comply out of fear rather than actual rules. But with her gone, the air felt lighter. There were, of course, remnants of Karen's reign still lingering. The HOA board had to sort through years of excessive fines and arbitrary regulations that she had imposed. Many homeowners who had been forced to make unnecessary changes to their properties were now seeking to reverse them. The most ridiculous rules, such as the ban on certain types of porch decorations and the fines for excessive holiday lights, were quickly abolished. The biggest change, however, was the shift in attitude. People started talking to one another more, forming actual bonds rather than just exchanging polite nods while keeping their heads down to avoid Karen's scrutiny. It was as if a long-standing tension had finally been lifted, and with it, a sense of real community began to take root. For me, the battle was finally over, but there was still one last matter to settle. The vandalism of my solar panels hadn't just been an act of petty revenge, it had been an actual crime. The police had gathered enough evidence to proceed with an investigation into Karen's actions, and while she had lost her HOA position, there was still the looming possibility of legal consequences. At first, I wondered if she would fight it, if she would try to spin the situation in her favor as she had done so many times before. But then, almost as suddenly as she had waged war against me, she disappeared. One morning, about a week after the HOA meeting, I noticed something strange. The curtains in Karen's house, which had always been drawn with meticulous precision, were now left open. Her front yard, once kept in perfect condition under her own strict rules, was starting to show signs of neglect. The real sign, however, came later that afternoon when a moving truck pulled up in front of her house. Within hours, workers were loading furniture, boxes, and carefully wrapped decorations into the back of the vehicle. Karen herself never appeared, but by the time the sun set, the truck was gone. The next day, a for sale sign was planted in her front yard. It was over. Truly, completely over. In the following weeks, the neighborhood continued to thrive without her. More residents began looking into solar panels, inspired not only by the cost savings but by the statement it had made, that one person's control couldn't dictate progress. I even helped a few neighbors research installation companies, happy to pass along the knowledge I had gained from my own experience. The irony wasn't lost on me that Karen's biggest battle had resulted in exactly the thing she had tried to prevent, a street that was slowly embracing solar energy. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the last of the sunset reflect off my panels, I heard footsteps approaching. It was Barbara, the now acting HOA president, carrying a thick folder. She handed it to me with a small smile, saying it contained the final reports on all the dropped HOA violations, mine included. Inside were the official notices stating that all of Karen's complaints against me had been dismissed, along with a formal letter from the HOA board acknowledging that she had overstepped her authority. It was a rare moment of validation, a written record of everything I had fought for. As Barbara turned to leave, she hesitated for a moment before saying something I never expected. She admitted that she had once admired Karen's ability to enforce rules, believing that strict order was necessary to keep the neighborhood pristine. But after seeing what real leadership looked like, people standing up for what was fair rather than what was dictated, she realized that true community wasn't about rigid control. It was about allowing people to have a say in their own homes, their own lives. It was an unexpected confession, but it showed just how much things had shifted. That night, I lit a small fire in my backyard, enjoying the quiet peace that had finally settled over my home. As I watched the flames flicker, I thought back to the chaos of the past few months, the battles I had fought, the stress of dealing with Karen's relentless pursuit of control. It had been exhausting, frustrating, and at times, downright infuriating. But as I sat there, watching the stars reflect off the smooth, dark surface of my solar panels, I knew it had been worth it. This wasn't just about a legal fight, or even about solar panels. It was about standing up against those who used power to manipulate and control, about refusing to back down when faced with injustice. It was about proving that one person could make a difference, even against an entire system built on intimidation. And in the end, that victory was bigger than anything Karen had tried to take from me. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood truly felt like home.